This is E2B, Energy to Business, a podcast by Opportune, where we bring you in-house expertise that serves all energy sectors. We examine emerging financial and technology trends and provide a broad perspective on ways to stay ahead, create opportunities, and execute market strategies. Hello and welcome to E2B, Energy to Business, a podcast by Opportune. Today's podcast is a conversation with Katie Rose Herd, Director at Opportune, and Steve Bradford, Managing Director at Opportune, about automation as a piece of a company's digital transformation initiative. So, Katie Rose and Steve, thank you so much for joining me here on the podcast.
Glad to be here.
Good to be talking with you.
Absolutely. Well, I'm excited to dive in and get into this topic as it relates to the oil and gas industry. And so, Katie Rose, how does automation and robotic process automation fit into the overall picture of a company's digital transformation initiative?
So robotics process automation, or RPA, it's just one piece of the puzzle to an organization's digital transformation journey. There are a lot of solutions out there that organizations are experimenting with and trying to adopt and see how it fits into their business. Cloud solutions, mobility, blockchain, artificial intelligence, natural language processing. And RPA is just one of those tools that is available. And I think currently organizations globally are looking to see how they can adopt RPA to be more agile and more efficient when there are disruptions and outages to the business.
Absolutely, yeah. This is one piece to a larger puzzle for sure. So, Steve, give me an idea of some of the RPA software products that are on the market. I know there are a lot, so condense it down and give us an idea of some of the big players.
Yeah, there's probably three that tend to surface and come to the top when it comes to RPA software products. Blue Prism is one of those, Automation Anywhere, as well as UiPath. And those are the ones that we predominantly see being adopted, especially within the energy sector.
Mm-hmm. So these products have been in place and have been adopted in the financial sector for a few years now, but it's just now kind of becoming in vogue for the energy sector. So, Steve, from your perspective, what types of things can the energy sector learn from the way that the financial sector deployed these products?
Yeah, indeed. And I guess to that point, right, the financial sector arguably has been at this, I would say, arguably somewhere 7 or 8 years into their journey, right? Mm-hmm. Where energy's probably started, many of them started on a global basis, really starting to adopt RPA in a meaningful way over the last 3 to 4 years. So I guess with that head start, right, the financial sector itself has certainly proven out the products, helped each of the software vendors ensure that their products are both feature rich and able to provide the level of automation necessary for complex system landscapes, but also have dealt with scalability issues so that certainly the energy clients drafting behind the financial sector can certainly benefit from the fact that they're going to be deploying a software framework that's going to be far more scalable over the long haul. Mm-hmm. In terms of I would say some of the lessons learned from the financial sector, there's probably 2 or 3 that are probably worth noting. I think one has to do with when you first begin your journey, if you will, within RPA, is investing in that technology framework and infrastructure up front, not viewing it just as the first 2 or 3 processes that we want to automate, but how do we establish an RPA infrastructure that's going to be scalable over time and allow us to grow allow the RPA framework to grow alongside the business. I think the second major lesson learned from the financial sector, and energy is also starting to see this as well, is not automating inefficiencies in the process just to automate the process. So you do need to upfront, as you're designing an RPA process, take a step back, look at that process, and make sure that the process itself that's been done for years in a certain way by the human workforce is actually the most efficient way to perform that given activity. Often we find that a heavy dose of re-engineering the process can be incorporated with the RPA digitization exercise. And I think the last one is establishing an effective governance structure for RPA up front. That is not an IT governance structure, but is a business-led governance structure that over the long haul can make sure that RPA is continuing to be used in an effective way for the organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I agree with that. I think it's those last 2 points are very important because, like you said, when you go through and you start really deep diving into the processes that exist, oftentimes you find out that they aren't good processes. So RPA will only, it will perform the same bad process. It will just do it faster.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. That if you put in inefficient processes, it's not going to all of a sudden correct those. It's just going to continue doing that. And so I think that's a really important thing to point out. And Steve, you brought up governance. Tell me a little bit more about why governance is a crucial part of ensuring the long-term success of RPAs. Can we go into a little bit more detail about that?
Yeah, sure. In terms of governance, I would say, as you start down the journey, no doubt you're going to set up an initial project that's going to take on establishing, again, the RPA framework and infrastructure and begin automating a handful of processes to establish momentum and prove what the RPA technology can do for an organization. I think when it comes to long-term governance, I think there's a distinction that I like to draw between project governance and evolving that towards just a long-term RPA governance process that's really going to look at what happens next, right? I think you're going to skill up your workforce both on the IT side as well as the business side on what RPA is and how to effectively automate processes within an RPA tool itself. And then once you've established, if you will, skilled resources that are able to take on new automations, the question becomes, well, what happens next and where should we, if you will, devote those resources next, right? It's a prioritization exercise. So where are we going to get the best benefit and ensure that the factory, if the RPA factory is put to good use on the next and most beneficial processes that are worth automating?
Yeah, and I think governance is also, the role is to kind of to help the business start thinking about their workforce in two different categories. So when you introduce RPA, you now have a digital workforce, and then of course you have your human workforce. And when you start thinking about it differently, you start thinking about how you allocate your resources and where you should allocate that work and going forward. An example would be new processes that are introduced as a result of new regulatory requirements. And sometimes these new tasks can be allocated to a bot rather than adding another thing to a human's to-do list. And people should start asking themselves, the question, who should do the work or parts of the work process?
Right. That makes a lot of sense to do that on the front end rather than thinking about it as an afterthought, right? To have that foresight, I think seems to make a lot of sense just from a procedural standpoint, to make sure that rather than doing this later, that it's done early on in the process, right?
Right, correct.
So, I think that it can be helpful for people to hear examples of how this has been deployed successfully in different organizations. And so I understand there's going to be confidentiality type concerns. So without naming any names of clients, how have you seen your clients deploy these solutions successfully? Do you have any examples of that?
So I've recently worked on a project in their supply and trading organization where we did deploy several bots to aid in their scheduling coordination organization. Some of the key factors to the success of the bots were some points that we've already made previously, that extreme due diligence up front, really analyzing and scoping out which processes are good candidates for automation. Like we said, you don't want to automate a bad process. In the process of going through this scoping and due diligence exercise, we did identify several things the business were doing that they could have been doing better. They didn't necessarily need to be automated. They just needed to change the way they had been doing it for years. And that was unplanned benefit from that exercise. I think the next thing is, making sure that we had the correct people in the room when we were having these scoping exercises was something that contributed to the solution's success. Making sure that, we had experienced people in the room that knew the process inside out and could tell us exactly what needed to be automated, which pieces of the workflow, and also ensured that we were automating the correct processes. They also helped us, evaluate the payback period for each process and the return on investment, which helped us in the prioritization of determining which of these kind of long lists of processes we wanted to tackle first. And then I think another key to the success is, having buy-in from the business users, building their confidence, having them involved throughout the entire development, the entire project lifecycle, so that at the end, you aren't just kind of dumping this new technology on their desk and saying you have to use it. They were already knowledgeable about what the bot was doing and what the results were going to be. And I think those are some of the things that can contribute to any RPA implementation success.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So as we begin to wrap up, I want to open up the floor to both of you to answer this next question, however you want to answer it. And kind of as we close things out, Cass and I more towards the future. So do you view RPAs as the future of oil and gas? And if so, just kind of give us a little idea of what that future looks like.
Sure, I'll kind of give you my impressions. I think the oil and gas sector, and given the, our recent pandemic times and the macroeconomic environment that we're going to be operating in over the next few months or possibly years, is going to continue to exert a lot of cost pressure on organizations. And RPA is going to play an important part in ensuring that organizations, especially our energy clients, are going to be able to either perform processes more efficiently from a cost takeout perspective, or at least be able to maintain and take on more work with their existing human workforce and cost structures from a labor perspective. So I think as we move forward and look at oil and gas sector and the cost pressures that are going to continue to be headwinds for our energy clients, I think RPA plays an important part in ensuring that they're able to remain competitive and profitable.
Yes, and I think with the wave of digital transformation, companies are continuing to explore how they can become more agile. As our world is ever changing. And RPA is something that can assist and be a tool in their tool belt.
Absolutely. Well, Katie Rose Herd, Director at Opportune, and Steve Bradford, Managing Director at Opportune, thank you guys so much for joining me here on E2B Energy to Business and sharing your thoughts on RPA and what the future looks like for the energy sector. So thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And everyone, thank you so much for joining us for this episode of E2B. We appreciate it very much. Of course, we have previous episodes of the podcast, so if this is your first one to listen to, make sure to go back and check out some of those other podcasts we have from Opportune. You can do that by finding the podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts these days. And of course, make sure to subscribe to stay up to date with the latest from Opportune. And of course, we'll be back soon with more episodes of the podcast. But until then, I've been your host today, Tyler Kern. Thanks so much for listening.